Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this special episode of IsraelCast, coming to you from the sidelines of the Jewish National Fund USA 2024 conference in Dallas, Texas. I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and before we bring on our guest, I just want to remind you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and supporting our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. And if you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you subscribed, rated, and reviewed us. 5 stars, of course, wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, we'd love it too if you shared the podcast within your orbit. All right, as for this episode, I am truly honored to welcome back Colonel Richard Kemp to IsraelCast. He was our guest just several months back, and indeed it's always a pleasure to be chatting with Colonel Kemp. Now, just by way of background, Colonel Kemp has spent most of his life fighting terrorism and insurgency, commanding British troops on the front lines of some of the world's toughest hotspots, including Iraq, Northern Ireland, and the Balkans. Most notably, he was sent to Kabul in 2003 to take command of British forces in Afghanistan. Most of the last 5 years of his military career were spent in Downing Street as head of the International Terrorism Team at the Joint Intelligence Committee, where he was responsible for producing assessments on the growing global terrorism problem for the Prime Minister and for the Cabinet. In 1993, he was appointed member of the Order of the British Empire by the late Queen for intelligence work in Northern Ireland and was awarded the Queen's Commendation for bravery for service as a commander in the United Nations Protection Forces in Bosnia. That was in 1994. And 2 years later, he was promoted commander of the Order of the British Empire CBE Military Division in the New Year's honors. Today, Colonel Kemp writes, lectures, consult. He also does podcast interviews, as you can see, and he does so on security, intelligence, and leadership, and is a strong advocate on behalf of the State of Israel and the IDF. You can learn more about Colonel Kemp's life and read his work on his website. It's richard-kemp.com. Once again, richard-kemp.com. We'll have a link to it on the show notes page of this episode on our website. And you can also follow him on Twitter as well. Colonel Kemp, it is such an honor to welcome you back to IsraelCast. Thanks so much for joining us. And this time, very happily, not on Zoom, but live.
Likewise, great pleasure to be with you.
All right. Well, listen, there are a bunch of bases that we have to cover in the short amount of time that we have. And I first want to start out with your trips to Israel, because since October 7th, you have gone there on numerous occasions. You've spent a considerable amount of time there. How do you think the country has changed over these last months?
Yeah, I've spent most of the last year since the 9th of October in Israel, moving in and out occasionally, but mostly I've been there. And it was a shattered country when I arrived on the 9th of October. Devastated by what had happened on the 7th, of course, as any country would have been. But it's picked itself back up. It's fought back very, very hard against the Hamas and Hezbollah and other attackers from around the region, including Iran, of course. And it's making great progress. I think the people, and I've been living with many people from Israel, including some of the internally displaced population of northern Israel, the people have had a very hard time there. Of course, economically, it's been devastated. They've seen many of their relations killed or seriously wounded inside Gaza and in Lebanon as well. And they've, of course, families have been worrying about their sons and daughters who have been at the fight for a long period of time in many cases. Many reservists have been called up. It's had a serious effect on Israel, of course it has. But I believe Israel has shown itself to be extremely resilient. And I think going from what I would describe as a really shattered country now to being a much more back to its self-confident self and looking forward, I think, towards the end of the war.
And you've been in Gaza. Tell us what you've seen there.
I've been in Gaza several times with the IDF. And I've watched their fighting. I've watched the actions they've been taking. And that includes attacks against terrorist positions. And it also includes other areas they've been criticized for, which is humanitarian aid deliveries. And from everything I've seen, the lies that are being spread about Israel are exactly that. They are lies. The IDF have been taking enormous care to minimize the loss of civilian casualties inside Gaza while doing the best they can to annihilate Hamas, while at the same time doing everything possible to get aid into Gaza. And I would say one thing, that despite the criticism of Israel's aid operations in Gaza and its facilitation of humanitarian aid into Gaza, this is the first time in history that I'm aware of when an armed force has facilitated aid deliveries into its enemy population while fighting at the same time. And they get criticised for this, but they've done a phenomenal job and have I think, by their immense efforts, including things like opening new checkpoints into Gaza, building new roads inside Gaza specifically for aid deliveries, they've saved many lives of Gazan civilians.
Just how degraded, then, is Hamas? And we're going to be talking about the north in just a moment, but also Hezbollah as well.
Hamas has been very seriously damaged. It's had its entire military infrastructure destroyed, all of its military formations that were prepared over decades and equipped with vast amounts of money to fight against Israel. They've all been destroyed. And now what we've got left is we've got small groups, individuals fighting and carrying out guerrilla actions against Israel, not organized formed military units, but smaller groups, as well as there's still significant quantities of munitions there. And there's miles and miles, still miles, hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath Gaza, some of which contain munitions, some contain terrorists, all of which will have to be destroyed over time. It's going to take a long time, but Hamas is definitely on the back foot. There's no way Hamas now can present a serious threat to the population of Israel as it did before and on the 7th of October.
And then what about Hezbollah?
Hezbollah has also been very badly hit. It's had its leader killed, Hassan Nasrallah. It's had the IDF and Israeli intelligence carried out an extraordinary operation against the leadership of Hezbollah with the pagers and the radios loaded with explosives, which I don't think has ever been an example of anything like that.
It's like out of a James Bond film.
Exactly. And science fiction. It's some kind of, it's probably the most targeted and precise and wide-scale military operation against a terrorist group that's ever taken place. And I think we should take our hats off to Israel for doing that.
No pun intended, but it blew your mind.
Right, it certainly did blow your mind. It blew my mind, that's for sure. And Hezbollah is not going to recover from that. They've lost their primary means of communications. They're nervous of using any electronic equipment. They've had so many of their leadership taken out. And they've had their military fighting ability very badly degraded to the extent that now I don't believe that Hezbollah can launch a really significant large-scale rocket attack against Israel today. I think they can still attack, they can still fight IDF soldiers on the ground, they can still launch missiles, but nothing like the level they could before.
Colonel, one thing I don't understand is UNIFIL and UNIFIL's role in southern Lebanon, because certainly they were there to make sure Hezbollah didn't get any traction there, but Hezbollah not only got traction, but they got the tunnels and they got the weaponry in. So how do you explain that?
Well, I've worked as a member of a number of United Nations missions in the past. And the United Nations, I mean, the only way I was ever able to achieve what I needed to do in United Nations missions was stepping outside the UN mandate. And for example, I was able in Bosnia to prevent a certain ethnic cleansing operation in Bosnia, but only by going outside my mandate as a UN soldier, UN commander. Because basically the UN, certainly in Lebanon, have been spectators. And I'm not sure the extent to which they've actually deliberately turned a blind eye or just been unable to do anything about it. But they've basically been spectators under their noses against their mission. Hezbollah have been building up and increasing the militarization of southern Lebanon, which was the UNIFIL's mission to prevent. And when you look at their kind of sister organization, if you like, in Gaza, UNRWA, they went even further, and they have not just not done their job. Okay, UNRWA is not a peacekeeping organization, but they've been complicit in a large way with Hamas terrorists.
And so how do you explain that? Is it that the UN and UNIFIL knew about this, or was it that they just weren't keeping a close care about it, or how does that work?
I think UNIFIL knew about it. They knew exactly what was going on, or to a large extent knew what was going on. Mm-hmm. And some of the information I believe they did pass to Israel, but not as much as they could have done. And you know, okay, there's issues with their mandate, but what they should have done was at least to make it known. I think the UN should have made it known the extent to which Hezbollah was going against UN Resolution 1701, which demanded the demilitarization of southern Lebanon. And now, of course, we've got UNIFIL effectively acting as human shields for Hezbollah, maybe inadvertently, but the Israelis asked UNIFIL to withdraw from southern Lebanon because it was about to be attacked, and UNIFIL refused to do so. The only time I'm aware of that a UN mission has failed to withdraw if it no longer had the consent of the parties to a conflict, and they didn't. And you've got to ask the question why the Secretary General of the United Nations wanted to keep UNIFIL in place as human shields for Hamas, for Hezbollah.
And that is the $64,000 question. Of course, he's not going to answer that. De-radicalization. Certainly there are efforts now to demilitarize both Hezbollah and Hamas, but to de-radicalize, where do you begin with that? I mean, you just referenced UNRWA, for example. Surely it has to begin in part with education, but it has to be so much more, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that de-radicalization, certainly in the short to medium term, is even possible. I mean, you've got a population in Gaza which has been educated and indoctrinated over decades to hate Israel, to see Israel as the enemy, to support Hamas, and to see Hamas as being their government and their friend. So that was the start point on the 7th of October. You had a very, very hostile population in Gaza, and we know the extent of their hostility because even those who were allowed to go and work inside Israel were gathering intelligence on the communities they were working in in preparation for the attack on the 7th of October. So that's where you start. Since then, of course, they've experienced the devastation of war. Many, many people in Gaza have been killed, civilians included. They've seen their property, their houses, the whole of the civilian infrastructure pretty much destroyed, not all of it, but a large extent of it. And that's not going to help towards de-radicalization. But at the same time, Israel couldn't have done anything else. Israel had to deal with it that way, and it had to accept the fact that this was not going to kind of in any way ease the problem they've got with the population in Gaza. But the question is, how much worse has it made it? And I think if you start off with a very hostile population, I don't think the difference is immense.
And the population is so young. And when we think about Israel's disengagement in 2005, that's 18 years already that Israel's been out of the picture as of 2023. And those kids were raised on UNRWA books and with this UNRWA education.
Absolutely. And I think life for the ordinary Gazan civilian was much better inside Gaza before 2005, before the Israeli, under Israeli basically administration. It was far, far better life. And the life for Gazans since then has become a lot worse. And as you say, they've been so heavily indoctrinated with the money that we have provided.
It's our tax dollars.
It's our tax dollars that we provide, or tax pounds in my case, that we provided to UNRWA, to the United Nations. And they've been using it to indoctrinate civilians in Gaza. And the same applies, by the way, to the West Bank, to Judea and Samaria, where the same degree of indoctrination has been taking place, again, with our tax dollars.
The last time we spoke about the media, and you had mentioned that certain outlets will invite you to talk about Ukraine or some global issues, but they won't talk to you about Israel. And I'm just wondering if you can give us an update, if they've changed their mind, if you have gone on Sky News, for example, or BBC to talk about the war with Gaza and as well the war and what's going on with Lebanon.
Yeah, the answer is not really no. And I've done a few interviews on the BBC, but mainly in connection with the Iranian attack on Israel. Mm-hmm. But broadly speaking, they don't want to hear my perspective because it doesn't suit their agenda. I look at it, I've been on the ground in Gaza, I've been observing the conflict for many years now, but particularly in the last year. I understand the reality. I've got a military background which enables me to do that. The BBC don't have anything like that. They have merely the political bias of their editorial staff as well as their journalists on the ground. And the last thing they want is somebody who can present themselves as some kind of military expert to contradict what they're saying. So the answer is no, they don't want me on there, and I very much doubt they're going to have me very much in the future.
And that's why we have you on IsraelCast, right? Just to go back to the IDF and its mission in Gaza, can you dispel myths about the IDF is targeting civilians and how awful the IDF is and so on? Because I have friends here and people in my circle that are ultra critical of the IDF, and they're only getting their information from God knows what sources. And I'm just wondering if you can dispel the myth.
Yeah, I mean, the anti-IDF propaganda that's been prevalent over this war has been built up over many years. The IDF is painted as basically a war criminal machine, and it's far from that. As I said, I've observed the IDF operations. I know inside out. I know the way that the IDF works, both in terms of its combat operations and in terms of its broader observance of international law and Israeli law. And I know the extent that the IDF goes in its legal elements to bring to justice anyone who does commit a crime in Gaza, for example. And of course, it happens. Every army has soldiers who do the wrong thing, either by mistake or deliberately. Every army has bad soldiers as well as good soldiers, and the IDF is not excluded from that. But the difference is between the IDF and the British Army and the American Army and armies of non-democracies is that those people are then brought to justice when their crimes are uncovered. So I'm intimately aware of that, and I know the extent to which the IDF go to minimise the loss of civilian life on the battlefield. And it exceeds any other army, anything any other army has ever done or been able to do in history to minimise the loss of civilian life, particularly when you bear in mind that your enemy is doing everything it can to try and get you to kill their own civilians in order to discredit and to delegitimize Israel.
And when you saw what happened in Amsterdam just a week or two ago with those thugs that were targeting Israeli Maccabiah soccer football fans, I'm just wondering, what did you make of that? And, what are you making of this radicalization that's taking place in Europe?
I mean, none of that surprises me at all. It didn't surprise me what happened in Amsterdam. The thing that I think should have happened was that it should have been prevented from happening by the police, who obviously didn't do the job they were there to do. And I think that there should have been a stop put to it. But that doesn't necessarily address what lies behind it. And I don't think that what happened in Amsterdam would not happen in the UK, would not happen in other European countries. I think it probably would happen in those countries if the police weren't able to stop it, as in Amsterdam. Because there is a very large community of people in all of our countries in Europe who have bought this anti-Israel propaganda and who want vengeance, and who are paid in many cases to extract vengeance. And that it's not just the violence on the streets, which was horrific. I mean, the city in which Anne Frank had to hide from her Gestapo murderers, on the eve of Kristallnacht, when Jews were murdered and their shops looted and their houses and synagogues burnt down and women raped, on the eve of Kristallnacht, we've seen something, not the same, but we've seen the same kind of behaviour on the streets of Amsterdam, and I think it's absolutely shocking, but not surprising, because this is I think this is the mood of large elements of the anti-Israel communities, and you see it in a less, I suppose, less violent way very often, hopefully less violent, on university campuses across our countries. Protests, demonstrations, bullying and intimidation of Jews on the campuses, reminiscent, I should say, of the way that Jews were treated in Nazi Germany in the early 30s and later 30s as well. So it's deeply, deeply troubling. And I think it behoves our governments to do what they can to put a stop to it. And yes, there's the policing element of it, but there's also the countering of the propaganda, which is so widespread. And it can be done, and it should be done. And our governments, I believe, they're not the spokespeople of Israel. They shouldn't be the kind of voice of Israel, but they should, I think, in the same way as they attempted and successfully attempted, certainly in the UK, to prevent a lot of the disinformation about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They should be doing the same in relation to Israel. They should be taking efforts to get the truth out there as opposed to the lies.
And just real briefly as we wind down the conversation, because I'm super mindful of the clock and your time as well, I think you're hopeful, though, for the future. I mean, before we came in, I saw you sitting with a bunch of young people, chatting with them, hearing from them, listening from them, and probably giving them advice as well. And are you hopeful? Did I get that right?
I'm very optimistic about the future of Israel. I'm less optimistic about the future of Europe. I think there's much more work to be done there. But as far as Israel's concerned, I think Israel's going to come out of this war much stronger that went into it. Firstly, I believe that Israel is going to defeat Hamas and Hezbollah. And then it needs, of course, to turn its attention not only to the other six fronts that it's fighting in, but also to the head of the octopus, Iran. And that's something I think can be done with the support of the United States of America. And I hope the new administration is going to give Israel a freer hand in dealing with Iran than the current administration is doing. So I'm confident they're going to win, and I think they're going to come out stronger because, one, generations of Israelis have now been fighting, old Israelis, young Israelis, have been fighting for their country, sacrificing, in some cases giving their lives, seeing their friends wounded, families bereaved. And it's a terrible thing. War is a really terrible thing. But any country that's gone through it for this length of time comes out much stronger, much more fortified as a country and its identity reinforced. Secondly, Israel now knows who its friends and enemies are. And I think we don't need to go through it, but Israel knows who it can and can't rely on, and therefore will become more self-sufficient. And that's already started, particularly in the field of armaments and munitions. Thirdly, I think the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora around the world, including here in the United States, has woken up more now to the reality of what Israel faces and what they themselves face, with all the stuff we've seen on the streets and in the university campuses and at the UN, etc. And therefore, I think, hopefully anyway, will strengthen their support of Israel, which is so important. And then finally, I think Israel's seen now to be successful. It's seen to be a tough guy in the Middle East, more than it was before. That will reinforce relations with Arab countries in the Middle East. They recognize and appreciate strength. They fear Iran as much as Israel has need to be concerned about Iran. And I think that will lead to the development of relations between Israel and the Arab countries. And I do include in that Saudi Arabia. And I'm pretty confident that in the near future we will see an extension of the Abraham Accords into Saudi Arabia.
All right. And on that note, we're going to leave it right there. Colonel Richard Kemp, so wonderful to have you. Thanks so much for joining us here on IsraelCast, and I hope to see you again face-to-face before too long.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Maybe in Israel. All right, and we'll have info about Colonel Kemp on the show notes page of this episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast, and we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. I don't know why you'd want to miss an episode, so do follow us on all social media, and also do go to our website, jnf.org, and on all podcast platforms. And as I always say, it takes a homo shop to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, J.D. Krebs, and Ellie Kodrin. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, I know Colonel Kemp would love to hear from you, and so would I. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz from Dallas, Texas. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.